A very good morning. It's not Sunday, it's Monday, and I'm ready to Exodus with you. Exodus through ancient eyes. Why is it so important? Why are we spending all this time? Well, why am I spending all this time uh, researching and studying this particular subject? Because at the end of the day, if you dig deep enough in Christianity, you're going to end up with the Exodus for a lot of the ideas that you hold on to, a lot of the beliefs that you subscribe to. And so this is why it's such a crucial and also sometimes a very touchy issue, is the historicity of Exodus, or understanding Exodus. And there are many ways to understand Exodus. Um, we are following a book called Exodus for Normal People by Peter Enns. And we're just walking through that slowly, discovering some new things, having a look at what the ancients would have seen, what they would have thought um, when they engaged the book of Exodus. Now, that's a difficult exercise because we are not ancients, we are moderns, we think in completely different terms. Our words mean different things. These languages are basically extinct to some degree. And so, we're clutching at straws at the time. But at least we're trying to clutch at straws that seem to be evidential. In other words, what the evidence tells us about this amazing book. Make no mistake, Exodus is an amazing book, put together in quite a interesting way by the redactors. But as we've seen throughout this series, we realize that Exodus, the Bible, Old and New Testament, are very, very layered, and that these layers build up in some cases over centuries, and that there are many. Although we might have a final redactor that sits and puts everything together, whether it be a single person or maybe a small team of elite Israelites in the 6th century, we're not 100% sure, but we know that it was more or less put together at that time, rewritten. The oral stories were brought together, often multiple sources, because we know the type of Hebrew that is used in, for instance, the Torah, and we know that it's from this time. So we've basically eliminated the idea that Moses sat down and wrote this down. Moses did not write Deuteronomy, and Moses did not write Genesis or Exodus. These are ancient traditions, oral traditions, transferred from generation to generation by people who were interested in their own history and who wanted to make it relevant again for the people of their time. And so we see also that even so it is with the Torah is written down to preserve a culture in some sense, but also to make the history of the people of Israel relevant to the people of the time of writing. And this people, they are people, they've been disenfranchised, they've been chased out of their land, they basically sit in exile and then slowly start coming back to their land. And so they start writing things down. Now, I want to jump back into our series. I think this is episode 10. And this episode is going to be touching briefly on the very old songs in Exodus, particularly one in Exodus 15, I think it is, the Song of the Sea. And then I want to jump to something that links into that, which is this idea that from the writers of the biblical library's perspective, from their point of view, it seems like as time went on, their views about God kind of changed, right? And this comes to no surprise to us. We know that Israel was a nation that was really steeped in Canaanitic religion, and that they kind of really came from that background. There's a lot of evidence that shows us that this is true. And so we should not be surprised if the earlier materials look a lot more like Canaanitic religion. And this is exactly what we do find. From an archaeological perspective, from a demographical perspective, where these people originated, what they did, how they did their pottery, etc., etc., but also from the scriptures. There's a lot of writings that seem to have been simply adapted from some Canaanite religious writings, and some of the concepts about the God Yahweh seems to have originated in very, very early Canaanitic religion and ideas. I'm currently doing a little series while I'm preparing for it. It's called The Oldest Myth in the Bible, and it's about the Leviathan. You might have heard about this creature. Some just make it off as a dinosaur or some big crocodile. But when we read the contemporary Canaanitic literature that we have now from Ugarit, we realize that this was actually a mythical creature of that time. And there were some of the earliest myths about and creations was or involved the high god, actually slaughtering this Leviathan, and that's how creation starts. Okay, but enough about that. The point of that is there's traces of this right throughout our scriptures, and you'll be really, really surprised how much of it really is there. The point I'm trying to make is that today we'll be focusing quite a bit on if I can call it, the evolution of the perspective on God within the Hebrew Bible. Just a couple of main points, but maybe just to lift it up, put it on a table, and you can make of it what you like, and go back and research it for yourself if you please. But it seems that with the general scholarship, scholars are quite convinced that this is in fact what actually happens. So we'll get back to that today. Let's just go back to chapter 15 of Exodus. It's a song sung by Moses and the Israelites, and it's called the Song of the Sea, formerly. I think sometimes it gets confused with the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy, and we don't want to do that, so we'll call it the Song of the Sea from here on. It is to celebrate God's victory at the sea. Now, the first line of the song is repeated again in verse 21 when it's sung by Miriam and all the women, right? And we're assuming that Miriam is the unnamed sister of Moses who safeguards Moses at the floating basket in chapter 2. And now she is again present at this miraculous water separation salvation event. Now, this song in chapter 15 seems to be a poetic version of the prose in chapter 13 and 14, which once again gives us kind of like two very similar versions of the story. This two-version literary convention is also found in other places in the Bible. For example, in Deborah, the story of Deborah is first told in prose in Judges 4, and then in poetry in Judges 5. My creepy is acting up again every time I come and sit here. So scholars have long considered that the poetic versions are probably the older versions. There's many reasons for that, not really want to go into that over here, but that the songs are older than the actual stories. So possibly because songs are easy to remember, they can preserve information over longer times and they could possibly resist to some degree change better than oral stories. So that's just like kind of like the general consensus. But also from a linguistic side, Exodus 15 and Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, as I've mentioned, seems to be, from a linguistic side, the two of the oldest pieces of literature found inside the biblical canon or inside the biblical library. And in this, when we say linguistics, what we mean is that by the type of language, scholars believe that these are quite a bit older. So as you would know yourself, language itself evolves. If you were in South Africa 300 years ago, the Afrikaans that would have been here would have been basically a Middle Dutch, and it kind of evolved over the last 400 years to be what we have today. So we could then very easily, if we had a poem written by Jan van Riebeeck, it would not sound like modern Afrikaans, and we would know that it was written a long time ago, as compared to maybe something from a more contemporary poet. If they were bundled together into an Afrikaans poetry, what's the right word? I forgot the word. Fancy word for a collection of poems. We would immediately know which one is the older poem. Now that's what's happening in Exodus 13, 14, and 15, also Judges 3, 4, and 5. The poems are written in older Hebrew, older ways of writing, and the linguists that make it their life's work to deal with these evolutions of languages, they tell us that these poems seem to be quite a lot older. All right, so Some date these poems to a pre-monarchic era, which means before there were kings in Israel, meaning before David. That puts us maybe at the end of the Bronze Age, in the second millennium BC. And now that's really early, as we understand most of the canon or most of the Hebrew Bible to be written quite a bit later. The final, at least, that we have at least 400 years after that, right? So you can see that these are quite a bit older parts of Exodus. So some of the narrative and some of the Song of Moses seems to be slightly out of sync, and that's exactly what we would expect. But perhaps the most striking difference is that the song does never mention the one thing that's very central to the Exodus 13 and 14 narrative is the splitting of the sea. We don't find an explicit mention of the splitting of the sea in chapter 15 in the poem. Perhaps the song version does not mention the Reed Sea parting because it does not need to, but it seems like the song version describes the death of the Egyptians quite differently. Throws the horse and the rider into the sea, and the Egyptian chariots then descend to the depths of the sea. A huge flood that comes and overtakes them. It's a very slight difference, but it does once again give us an idea that these songs probably evolved, the story probably evolved over time. Some scholars have concluded that the earliest version of the Exodus story did not in fact include the split sea then. That detail is something that kind of was added a little bit on to, and here's the crux, to bring this idea of the splitting of the seas and the collapse back in of the seas, to tie that very closely with the creation and flood narratives, because they also type of idea in Genesis, splitting of the oceans twice, to make life and land and life possible. And we have, of course, in the Noah account, the the killing or the judging of God's enemies by the rising of the waters and this chaos water that comes back. And so the Egyptians also dies in a very same way, a very similar way. So scholars are saying this, that initially we might not have had this, that this probably was added by scribes a little bit later on, as they were masterfully tying this in to the creation account and the Noah flood account. We can see that although it's been embellished over time, the Exodus story is indeed a very old tale, and possibly one of the oldest memories of the Israelites. Now, as it might be one of the oldest historical memories, in other words, with a historical kernel, what I'm working on at the moment, the oldest myth in the Bible is this idea of the Leviathan, and this mythical idea of the Leviathan is of course way older. And so actually Genesis 1 is also a newcomer on the block in terms of creation myths. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our next series. We want to take you from the old ancient Mesopotamian myth of chaos kampf, it's called by German scholars, where a god has to beat the chaos waters and the monster in the waters, how that became part of Canaanite ideas, actually first ancient Hittite ideas that bled over into Canaanite ideas that came to the Israelites, and it was the masterful Israeli scribes who turned it into a mythologized Genesis 1:1. And so we kind of have the evolution, the trail of the evolution of the Genesis 1 story, and it is an amazing story to tell. It's the evolution of the story itself is an amazing tale, and it really intrigues me, and therefore that's something I'll be doing next. Okay. So back to these songs. These songs seem to preserve some of the oldest linguistic material, so the oldest written down material in the Bible. And then it should come as no surprise to us that when we, in these poems, consider what the writers of these poems, what their view of God is, that it would be a very ancient one indeed. And so as I think we spoke about that last time, but we'll just go through this again. in these very old ideas, we see God portrayed as a very explicit warrior, king, out for vengeance and blood and honor and glory. Not a view that sits very well with me or a lot of people. Um, but we see this, I don't want to say but, we see this as a very ancient view of God. And in fact, that's one of the things we're talking about today, that this view actually evolves over time. All right, the little sun baking on my back here. I feel like a little lizard in the sun here. So part of this ancient memory is also the depiction then of God as a fierce, violent warrior who is praised for killing a lot of people. It's not uncommon to hear scholars muse over the idea that Israel's oldest view of God is in fact a warrior, a cloud-riding warrior, storm god type of idea, influenced by other ancient tribal warring cultures. Over the centuries, many over the centuries, other metaphors for God enters the canon, the biblical library, and then becomes quite a lot softer as God as a gardener or a planter or a potter or even the civilized lawgiver. It's really a tempting thought and understandably reductionist to consider that ancient depictions of God could have evolved or has definitely evolved in a very systematic way. Probably hasn't evolved in a very systematic way, but there seems to be enough evidence to make a case that the idea of God in the biblical library does shift over time. God seems to be later in the Old Testament portrayed as less violent and less harsh, uh, way less indirect, less direct involvement in mass killings, etc. And in some cases, God is then gets portrayed as someone who's actually against the acts of violence that were once divinely declared to be okay. For example, the book of Nahum praises God's destruction of the Ninevites, the capital of Assyria, those who took the north tribes of Israel in the 8th century BC into captivity. However, when we get to the book of Jonah, which is written quite a bit after Nahum, God has compassion on the Ninevites, and he actually begs them, he puts repentance in front of them, and as far as I understand, they do repent. There's a couple of examples like this. I don't want to go in, but what I would like to read to you is a portion from Exodus 15, where God is portrayed as this very bloodthirsty kind of warrior king. It praises Yahweh for destroying his enemies by drowning them in the sea. Let's read verse 1 to 3. It sets the tone. I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider has he thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The warrior, Yahweh, is his name. And for drowning the Egyptians, Yahweh, the warrior, is praised unequally amongst the gods. And so chapter 15, verse 11 says the following, says, who is like you, Yahweh, amongst the gods? This again just confirms that there were ideas of multiple gods still at that time, but that in the Israelites' mind, or at least the writers here, God is the best of all the gods, basically. I think this is called henotheism or monolatrism. And it's kind of like just the idea of it's not completely polytheistic, although it is polytheistic in that it sees many gods, but it only worships one of them, where monotheism would not recognize any other god. And as we've said multiple times, the early Israelites were not monotheists. They basically, in my view, evolved slowly from monotheism, from polytheism into henotheism, and into the monotheism of the second temple period, which is after the exile. And some would even say that the monotheism after the second temple period is a result of the priestly class. But let's leave that out for today. Okay, so in verse 17 and 18, there's a very revealing little bit of information. The passage begins like this. You, excuse me, you, Yahweh, brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your possession, the place, O Lord, that you made your abode. To that mountain, and now the question is, what mountain is this song talking about? Because if it is talking about the temple and Mount Zion, where God did plant them in Canaan, it's completely anachronistic, because that would not have been the case in the time of the Exodus. In other words, just once again pointing towards the fact that this was written much later. Even if this is some of the earliest material, it's still after the Israelites were already in Jerusalem and in Canaan, and that they're taken the land. Okay, so let's just back to the question. I've jumped ahead of myself a little bit. The obvious answer that one wants to give is, when you ask what mountain is this, is you want to say it's Mount Sinai, because that's the proper context. But there's a lot going on here. Why does the author say you brought them in and planted them using the past tense and third person? That's interesting. It doesn't sound like someone that's there to whom it's busy happening. You might have expected it to read something like the mountain where you are bringing us and planting us. But this planting in this version, in this verse, sounds rather permanent. Sinai was never a permanent fixture. God didn't make his abode at Sinai. So really, reading a little bit further on clarifies this a little bit better. It says, the sanctuary, O Lord, where your hands have established. So the mountains kind of turn into a sanctuary. And the question is, what is this really referring to? And the next line reads that the Lord will reign forever and ever. So the question begs from... So I definitely got bombed out there. Okay, I'm back on. All right, sorry. I think I had an internet interruption there. So it does really seem that this is really talking about Mount Zion in Jerusalem, talking about a more permanent fixture, sanctuary, something like the temple, and in Canaan. And the further you read on later, it seems like it becomes clearer and clearer that whoever's writing the song is writing it after the Israelites are in Jerusalem and they have a sanctuary there on Mount Zion, which tells us that it's almost anachronistic to the language time. The point is, for now, we need to point out that this is a very ancient poem. Like I said, this is the problem now. This poem may be 1200 BCE, but even in it, we have ideas that point to a time after the Exodus, and it's referred to this time of planting and fixture and rule forever ever in past tense. And the question is why? And some of these weird tenses, past tenses, in this old song already starts in chapter 15, verse 13 and 16, where the writer is describing Israel entering the land of Canaan. The neighboring nations, Edom, Moab, Canaan, tremble, they melt away, they're filled with horror and dread, and it becomes still as a stone until your people pass by. Now, verse 17 makes more sense. You brought them out and planted them in, or planted them. So it makes more, it really makes no other sense that it's already talking about Zion in this very ancient poem that should be way pre-Zion, pre-temple, and so on. The point is simply that it seems like someone might have edited or worked with this very ancient poem from a much later time. Okay, so, and they might have, the writer might have done this very purposely, hoping that you would pick up on it, because the temple in Jerusalem is, to them, it seems to be an equivocation of the moving tabernacle, which is a picture or a metaphor, or a movable manifestation, rather, of Mount Sinai. So it seems to be all tying into one place, the dwelling of God, although it starts at Sinai and ends at Mount Zion. All right, so the point is that the editors are not really trying to hide this, and they are entering that poem and they are writing it from a new perspective. They're trying to make the past relevant for their present. And this type of movements we find a lot in the Old Testament. Okay, so very quickly now, many people have taken issue with God killing a lot of people in the Old Testament, especially many innocent people, for the sake of honor, which really becomes a moral problem. Our traditional response to that has always been God should not be questioned. He is almighty, he can do what he wants, and he works in mysterious ways. But these type of explanations, they kind of leave a bad taste in the mouths of people who are really looking for answers, because it's really a nil answer. It doesn't make any sense of morality itself. Can God then violate the ideas of morality that seems to be quite ubiquitous within humanity, which he created? Can he violate that and do all of that under the cover of being mysterious? We who've been made in his image, then can we do the same thing, or should we all just stand up and say, no, it's wrong to kill innocent people? And that this ancient view is exactly that. It's an ancient view of God. It seems to us that Jews and Christians have been working through this moral conundrum for a very, very long time, 2,000 years and more. But it stands to reason, and this is also my point of view, that the language about God in these passages tells us little about the God of the infinite cosmos or what he is like. It tells us a lot more of how ancient tribal cultures depicted their gods. The glorification of God's violence is one of the reasons. This is what the writer says. He says why he doesn't read the story as a literal story, but as a sincere depiction of God by people of a very ancient belief system, using the only language that was available to them. And this language was the religious language of a tribalistic Iron Age society. So the best and meaningful conversations about the Bible come actually when we are willing to not ignore, but embrace how the Bible bears the marks of its own time and space. It was written by real people who wrote in a way that made sense to themselves and to the people of their time, of course. We need to accept the responsibility that this is there, and that as people who hold the scriptures dear, um, we have to carefully connect that ancient text with our own time and place. And this, in fact, is what theology is and should be in the first place, the logic about who God is. Now, a violent presentation of the God of Israel is part of the biblical library that cannot be ignored. We have to take it seriously by trying to understand the historical setting. Um, Defending these stories as perfect historical accounts, of course, binds us to this ancient tribal view of God. It means we can't move on from them. Um, and it seems like this library, the Bible, actually transitions from this ancient view itself. And shouldn't we then, as those who hold the scriptures clear, also move on as the scripture itself does? The Bible here, with specific respect to this particular issue, it kind of forces us to either sear your own conscience and just pretend like it's okay and it's all mysterious and we don't want to know or want to understand how justice or um, violence should work or could work in the world, or we have to create such a massive dissonance, and actually end up living in a moral hypocrisy where we think it's okay for God to kill innocent people, but we shouldn't. Um, like it's just it. The problem with that is the whole thing about Christianity is built on the idea that we should be like God, and that creates a real problem there. If Genesis 1 is correct, that's our reason for existence, is to be the image of God. And so it's the problem is this: do we as Christians move forward trying to conform our world and our society and ourselves to ancient tribal views of God written down, um, or do we say no, hold on, these are in fact ancient tribal views and we can move on from them? And I think I prefer the second option in this case. All right, I want to switch to what I promised, and that is to have a quick look at the movement or the transition of the perspective on God in the Hebrew Bible. I've got a couple of main points I would like to look at and quickly summarize, as we only have about 15 minutes left. But we're going to be looking at 4 particular things: God's presence and how that moves throughout the ancient Hebrew Bible, violence and judgment, how does that change, God's relationship with humanity, which is rather important, and then also the divine image. Okay, so there seems to be a perceptible progression in the portrayal of God across the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the way his nature is expressed in relation to violence, his presence, and his relationship with humanity. Now, here's the key. This progression seems to reflect, and if you can get this, you'll understand why it happens and how it happens, and you'll learn to kind of recognize it. The progression reflects cultural shifts. The progression reflects historical shifts. The progression reflects theological developments as the Israelite understanding of God evolves over time. One thing that really changed, well, can I change my life, but it really made a difference as to how I started reading the Bible, as I realized that the ideas in the Bible are not stationary at all. They are moving and evolving all the time, even within books sometimes. Gospel of John's a very good example of that. For instance, as late as New Testament writing, ideas evolve because we have later writers pinning down the carryovers from many decades, at least in the New Testament, and possibly also from many sources. And this is so much more magnified in the Old Testament. There's so many layers to what we finally see and read in front of us that it's inevitable that there are some shifts in this document, and specifically today with regards to God. All right, so let's start. Here's some key aspects of this type of progression. The first one is God's presence. Now, from Genesis to Moses, the early what's called theophanies, God's appearances, we can say the following things. In the early books of the Bible, God is depicted as having a more direct personal encounter with people, with humans. For example, we think of the Garden of Eden, where God walks with Adam and Eve, where he makes clothes for them. He's present, he's talking with them. He's like, it literally reads as if he's getting